Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Cup Editorials, our first episode of this new spin-off of The Cup. That's right, we have another tendril of our company.
Possibly the last one.
Possibly, you never know.
Which we will talk about, but
exactly.
Yes, sorry to interrupt. Continue.
No, all good, all good. Yeah, so this is an informal introduction to The Cup Editorials, as well as kind of your go-to guide for all things Cup of Hemlock / The Cup and what's going on with all these shows. Because, we have a lot of new members who are joining our teams. And, like sometimes they may go, what the heck is all this? Why is there not just one consistent show every week? Why do they keep having all these different things pop up every month? It's like, well, here's why. This is your go-to editorial video. There we go. There's the name. Roll credits. And basically, we're going to go through each of our different shows, the sub-series, and kind of give you a breakdown of what they are, so then you can then refer back to this as a kickoff point in case you need reminders of things. So joining me on this venture is, of course, my co-artistic producer, Ryan Borochovitz. Hello, Ryan.
Hello, Mac. Good to be here. Happy to talk about this thing we do.
Exactly. And Cup Editorials was something I pitched to you and Jill way back a few months ago when I came up with an idea for an episode that may be coming down the road. Who knows? Maybe episode 2, episode 3, episode 4, maybe one of the first batch we do. Basically, it was a mini version of the Roundtables, where you take a topic, you kind of spin it out on its own, because it doesn't really have a pro shot for us to talk about. It doesn't really have an interview for us to do. It's more just getting some people together to discuss a certain topic that pertains to everybody's opinions on it. For example, we have an episode coming up all about theater etiquette, where myself, Ryan, and Jill all weighed in on this surprisingly highly spicy topic. Who would have known? So, yeah. So, obviously, we're going to get more into what all this means. But, Ryan, what are your thoughts? What does the Cup Editorial mean to you?
Well, first off, why do we call it the Cup? Do you want to ask me something?
Oh, my goodness, Ryan. I was just ready to drive into this.
Yeah,
Ryan,
I was excited to drive in, but we have a ritual to get through first.
Yes, we do.
In case you are one of those newcomers listening to the show for the first time or coming to this after some confusion at whatever the first episode you listen to is, we always begin by asking each other what's in our cup, as per the title of the show. So I am drinking water at the moment. You got to stay hydrated, but I am drinking it out of the cup, which if you're listening to this as a podcast, it has our logo on it. So yeah, it felt pretty meta to be talking about the cup. Even though I use this for many of our episodes, I still felt like it was very appropriate to bring it out for this one. And yes, I'm just drinking water because it's kind of getting into the evening and I don't need any more caffeine right now.
That's right.
How about you? What's in your cup?
I am drinking a Crystal Light iced tea tonight. That is what is on my docket tonight. So there we go.
Fantastic.
That is it. Nothing too fancy. Just a cup of iced tea just to get me through the next little bit here. So, yeah. Okay. So back to you, Ryan. What are your thoughts on the Cup Editorials?
Yeah. So I think the editorial is very much, as I'm envisioning this type of episode, is just a place where, for the most part, we can check in as the editorial team, you, yourself, Jill, and myself, as the people who are responsible for making this cup, to kind of just check in every once in a while. Sometime, more often than not, I would say, it'll be about a specific topic that we want to discuss that doesn't quite fit into any of our other series. Right. And as a result, I would say why I chimed in to say, hopefully this is the last new series we will ever introduce. Not just because we have a lot, but because it is very much a catch-all net that anything can fit into. If it doesn't fit into one of the things we've already established, it can fit into an editorial. We could just call it that. Yeah. And as a result, I'm hard-pressed to think of anything that we could come up with that wouldn't at least be qualified as an editorial, and therefore maybe we don't need to introduce any more series from this point forward. To be determined. If we come up with a really good idea that justifies it, we can have that conversation. But we have quite a few of them, as we'll talk about in a moment. But at the end of the day, this is a space for us to check in and just talk about something that's on our mind. Maybe we'll be responding to some sort of current event in the theater world. Maybe we'll have some sort of big philosophical debate about something like theater etiquette.
Right.
that we have already filmed that episode. It is coming out fairly soon. We can't quite say how soon at the moment, but that will be on the horizon soon. And yeah, it's an opportunity for us as the people who make the cup to just voice our opinions. Occasionally we might have a guest. I would say these episodes will rarely bring together a large group because that it's sort of hard to differentiate them from the Roundtables, which is basically just a larger group version of this. But maybe one of the three of us who run the cup will bring on a guest to talk to about something that maybe they have special expertise in or a unique perspective or opinion on, and we can just bring them on. But more often than not, it probably will be just 2 or 3 members of our little golden trio here at Cup of Hemlock, where we get to just speak about the things that are on our mind or the perspectives we have. I'll emphasize that this is something that we conceived as a rule. We've said that we never will go into these episodes with written notes or like detailed plans of what we're going to say. I know I've been very guilty of that on other tendrils of the cup where, sometimes I write a vigorous notes about what I want to say about a show we're reviewing. Cough Warhorse was a big one. Yeah. But yes, we want to keep these conversations fairly casual. So it's not really about, I am the expert in this thing, I have strong opinions and I'm coming in, but it's more just about, let's just talk about it and see where our thoughts come to. And as a result, they might be a little more lax or a little more casual than some of the others. That said, even though I've described this as just like a bit of a casual check-in, I never want this to get to the point as a cup editorial where this is just like shooting the shit, where it's just, oh crap, we don't have an episode this week. Quick, Mac, let's just get in the room and talk about what we watched on Netflix this week. Like, that's not, if we ever do that, feel free to unsubscribe to your subscribers. Exactly. But no, we want to always keep it on something that's of some sort of pertinence to either the theater community, whether that be the local Toronto theater community that we service, or the broader community that's interested in things like the pro shots we review of National Theatre or Broadway HD, or maybe things that are just of pertinent interest to fans of the cup, as this episode breaking down the cup definitely seems like it would be to me. So that's it in a nutshell. We'll kind of come back to this idea at the end, but we'll sort of use this space to, at least today, get into the various tentacles of the cup that have gone in various different directions and use this as a nice space to guide people through what they all mean.
Yeah. I love that. And Ryan, I'm going to throw to you next again because you are the man who does great summaries as seen in our Nickleby episode. So why don't you give us a bit of a reiteration of our company history? So this way we can set up where we all started and kind of where we are now. Now, obviously there's a much more detailed history in our 99th and 100th episode. So we won't be going into a whole bunch of details there, but Ryan will kind of lay out for us where this all started and then kind of how we've grown and all the different tendrils and why, for example, why instead of just calling everything the cup, why we decided to brand things in their own lanes.
Yes, like this is the main reason why I felt like this was worth bringing up in the context of this editorial, because it's part of one of the things that people ask us about sometimes or might get curious about when they encounter the show. Is we have a lot of different names for the things we do, not just the separate branches of the cup, but the fact that we are called Cup of Hemlock Theatre. But if you're listening to this on a podcast, we are Cup of Hemlock Theatre Podcast, as opposed to just Cup of Hemlock Theatre as we are on YouTube and on our other social media platforms. So why the need to specify podcast on the podcast platform? Isn't this already a podcast in its own way? And the fact that we call all of our episodes The Cup as the short version. We ask each other what's in our cups. Like, is the thing called The Cup or is it called Cup of Hemlock? It makes it very hard for us when we're trying to, promote the show to people and tell them to tune in, when we have to remember, okay, what's the most effective way to call it so that people will actually be able to find the thing. So in order to kind of explain where all of these different names come from and why we've so staunchly commit to them, is that Cup of Hemlock Theatre, as that version of the name would suggest or imply, did not necessarily begin as a show that reviews plays or interviews artists. It actually was originally conceived by people other than ourselves, but to be a theater company. It was started by some good friends of ours, mainly William Bartley and Edmund Clark, who, if you scroll down far enough in our episode catalog, you will have seen them on other reviews. You will see some Meet the Team videos in which they are introduced as the artistic director and production manager, respectively.
Mm-hmm.
And they had conceived an independent theater company that they wanted to create that they named Cup of Hemlock Theatre. And they brought on various friends and colleagues of theirs, including us. Neck, you were brought on originally as a general assistant and then got promoted to marketing manager. I was brought on as literary manager, and Jill, who is the other member of our producing trio, was brought on as general assistant after you were promoted to marketing manager. But they had, visions of, the theater company they wanted to produce. We don't need to get into too much detail about the specifics, but this all came about in very early 2020 as something that would be producing live theater in the city of Toronto. And, funny thing about that year, 2020, who's to say what went on then? But just as we were planning on what would have been the first season of live in-person theater, COVID happened. Yes, there was a pandemic that maybe you heard of it, but it made the possibility of live in-person theater pretty impossible for a long time. And that's pretty debilitating when you are starting a new theater company, and especially if you can remember those early days when none of us knew how long this would go on for. Should we batten down the hatches long term, or will this blow over in a week? Who's to say? But a lot of the early programming that you'll see if you scroll down there was very much still in the spirit of this is a theater company first. We intend to do shows. And that's why we have things like the Cup of Hemlock proudly presents, which was that series of, well, if we can't do in-person theater, we'll do some shows. We called them polished readings at the time. That weren't necessarily like full memorized productions, but they were rehearsed, and for the most part they were rehearsed. The Merchant of Venice being the exception to that, which was just a cold read.
Oh, that was a cold read, all right.
That was a very cold read. But yes, we began in the pandemic days with just, well, let's take some public domain plays that anybody can do at any time, as so many theater companies were doing at this time in the pandemic, and let's just get some friends in a Zoom room and we'll do the play. At the same time, we were, sort of separate from Cup of Hemlock, but involving a lot of the same people. We had a play book club where a lot of us came together in the first place, and we just got together and read plays for our entertainment even before the pandemic, and then that really accelerated as something to do during the pandemic, get together with friends on Zoom and read a play. So a lot of the early programming kind of came out of that idea that, we did just a cold reading of Merchant of Venice. Then we thought we could do a little better if we rehearsed this a little bit. And then we did Ghosts by Ibsen as that. And then that was followed by Man of Destiny, by Shaw, in which you played the lieutenant.
I did.
Yes. And it was kind of becoming clear to us that those things that started off as, oh yeah, let's just get friends together in a Zoom room, were starting to get a little too ambitious. In order to keep the momentum of a theater company going, but cutting ourselves a little slack, we then turned those big proud to present productions into COH shorts, where we just did one or two short scenes from plays. And that was a lot of the early programming. But at the same time of all of that, you, my good friend Mackenzie, had a very good idea. You being the podcast baron that you are, before the Downbeat fame, you already had a podcast of your own prior to any of this. You had a great suggestion of something we could do while we were just twiddling our thumbs waiting for the COVID to go away. Because you noticed that the Stratford Festival, big theater institution here in Canada, was releasing pro shots of their various programming from the past decade or so. They had these fully feature film versions of the plays that were on their stages that they were releasing once a week to just give people something to watch during the pandemic. And what was the idea you proposed at the time?
Well, I mean, so I was going to watch these pro shots anyway. So it was one of those things that we need something to do. And we all, Will and Ed are big fans of Shakespeare as well. They are very much classically trained and love the language and Shakespeare. So it was like, okay, so there's a mix there. And Stratford had announced they were doing a few of these. It wasn't going to just be a one-off random video. So we said, why don't we do some reviews where we kind of, talk about the productions. We get into like some textual based questions too. So we're not just, harping on a show. We're actually going to use the show as a kind of a jump off point to dive into some deeper material. Kind of just how like when we do right before the Downbeat episodes where we talk about a musical, then we deep dive into a song. It's the same type of vibe that went on in there. And so we started that. And then Sure enough, the Scottish play was coming up. And I
Mhm.
said, well, I've worked with one of the witches before. Let me see if like Bridget would ever be down to, join our motley crew for an episode. And sure enough, she was like, yeah, I'll come on, sure. And then that kind of really opened the door to us going, okay, there's something more
We got
here.
something here.
We got something. We
Mhm.
got something cooking. And actually, it was thanks to us doing the Stratford reviews that we brought Jill on, because Jill was brought
Mhm.
on as kind of a differing voice. Because at the time, it was mainly an all male group. We had another marketing manager at the time, Shuba, who
Mhm.
wasn't interested in being on camera. So it was one of those things that we're going to be talking about a play, but it features daughters and fathers and daughters. So it's kind of important that we have somebody to, voice another
Represent team daughter.
team daughter. We need somebody who's team daughter.
Yeah.
So it was one of those things of, well, who do we have that we think would be a good outfit for us? And Jill was that person. And so that kind of, once again, opened the door to Jill coming on more and more and more as well. So it was one of those things where it was just by happenstance where you take the lemons of life and you kind of go, there's a bit of a tart lemonade we can make here, So yeah, so we started with that. And then once Stratford kind of finished with all their projects, so they have a certain amount they can show. It was, okay, well, what's next? So it was like, okay, well, we got Broadway HD. That was the next big one we did. And then we had National Theatre come along. And then now we've done Stratfest. And so, yeah, that kind of all grew from there. But it all kind of started with thanks to the Stratford Festival giving us a weekly YouTube stream to watch.
Mhm.
And that kind of sparked an online discussion afterwards. And we kind of spun out from there.
Yeah. And something that like I'll add there that I think you were very wise to bring this on. It's funny when we, as the original Cup of Hemlock team, still a theater company at this point, were proposing what do we even call this thing. One of the names that was floated by is, oh well, maybe this is Hemlock Reviews because it's the Cup of Hemlock team reviewing something.
Yes.
And I don't remember who
that was a big one. That was like a final contender for the name.
Yeah, it was. But then we ultimately went with the name The Cup. Not specifically at the time because we thought, ooh, this can leave us up so many tendrils or possible versions of this that aren't limited to reviews. We just thought that, well, we have cup in the name. This is a fun thing that everybody have a beverage and we'll just talk about a show over a drink, sort of recreate the atmosphere of going to a bar and talking with your friends after you see a show. Isn't that kind of nice? And so, yeah, what started as an idea of something that could have very easily been called Hemlock Reviews became The Cup, and it was presented just as something that this theater company would do to keep ourselves busy and wet our teeth a little bit while we're waiting for the opportunity to do some live theater. But as the pandemic kept getting on, we found other streaming services after Stratford that anywhere we could find professionally shot stage plays would create great fodder for the type of reviews we wanted to do that kept us going. And it was, as the pandemic kept going on, more theater companies like National Theatre, like Stratford, would develop their own streaming services like Netflix or Hulu or Amazon Prime and get into the streaming game. Who would have thought that that's something that theater companies would do?
National Theatre has like a vast archive of a show. And Broadway HD really was the first. Kind of like Netflix, where there was nobody collecting all these pro shots and theater-based productions that were filmed. So everybody kind of went the same way as Netflix of, well, why are we paying Broadway HD to stream our stuff when we can do it ourselves?
Yeah.
So,
especially during the pandemic when it's not like they were preoccupied with, well, we're doing live shows at the time. It was all they could do to keep themselves afloat. And it created a lot of these opportunities of subscriber-based services where you have access to very interesting catalogs of plays from some recent ones, some very old ones. And it's a great playground for us too, as people who clearly have opinions about theater to dive in. And something that was, I think, great about the model that we put forward for these non-Hemlock reviews, The Cup, at the time, is that we always made sure we had a panel of at least 4 people. Sometimes there would be a
4
fifth.
is the magic number,
But we never wanted less than 4 people on a review because it set it up that we have these differing perspectives, and it was very often mostly core members, but we brought in like people from like just friends from the theater community, people who were maybe involved in our polished reads or friends we knew from Play Book Club or from other productions that we were doing at the time, or maybe productions that we had done prior, and we just have all kinds of friends in the theater community. And it was a great way that created this sense of community during the height of the pandemic, that people would get together They'd all watch the same show and we'd have a conversation about it. And it was really nice. And I love that 4-person format that we called The Cup Nothing. But it was essentially all the episodes at the time were the Cup reviews, because we were reviewing a show with a panel of 4 people.
Yeah.
But then it developed in interesting ways. And something I'll say now before I get into this next section is that the version of this story that we are telling in this first editorial isn't necessarily the chronological narrative of how this developed. We will cut back and forth between why we're telling it out of order a little bit, but in order for this to be helpful as a guide to what are our different episodes, it makes sense to break this chronology and just talk about what makes this kind of episode different from that kind of episode.
Yes.
And fans of our show might notice that we have episodes that are titled The Cup Reviews, and we have ones that are titled, for some reason, Cup Duet Reviews.
That's right.
And lately, we've been doing a lot more duet reviews than review.
Yes.
And you might be wondering, what does this distinction mean? So, something that we started doing still during that pandemic time, but after that initial run of Stratford episodes, is we noticed that there were some theater shows that were being made available at the time for very short bursts. That was kind of the case with the Stratford stuff. They would put one up weekly and it would exist for 3 weeks and then disappear. But for the most part, we were, because nobody else, what else did we have to do at the time while we were all at home during the pandemic?
Exactly.
It was easy to get a panel together and keep pace with this weekly. As, all of our lives started developing a little bit, and we didn't have the regularity of a schedule like Stratford that every week there's a new one coming out. We still noticed that there were other shows being put online that didn't necessarily conform to that schedule, that we needed to become aware of and jump on quickly if we wanted to cover it at all. Sometimes it was a show that was just there for one time. Like Aisling Murphy, who had just been on an episode that we had done of a production of Death of the Salesman starring Brian Dennehy. She is the biggest Sarah Kane fan I've ever met, probably one of the leading authorities on this particular playwright in the whole world. And she brought to our attention that after appearing on her first appearance of the regular Cup reviews, that there's going to be a production of Sarah Kane's play Crave for one night only, live streamed from the UK, and it was staged in a very interesting way where the actors were on treadmills to preserve social distancing, but it was a live stream that you tuned into once and then it was gone forever. So and with that, the stakes being very high in that, we didn't feel that we can necessarily get together the 4-person panel who could all watch this show at the one opportunity that they had, unlike the Stratford things that were all available on YouTube for 3 weeks with plenty of time to watch it. It just felt like cumbersome to try to get the usual type of panel together. So something that we thought of at the moment, well, maybe every so often when there's something topical like this that's showing up for a brief period but would be hard to coordinate an episode in our usual style of, what if we just had 2 people see it and review it together? It allowed a format that could respond to current events in that way with less prep and less coordination, and would kind of be more of a skeleton crew version of the main reviews we did. And the name we came up for this premise at the time was Duet Reviews, because unlike the regular reviews that have 4 people, the Duet Reviews will only have 2. They're singing a song together like a duet.
Right, exactly.
Minus the singing. I think that term was probably your idea, if I'm remembering correctly. It was. It is, of course, musical in nature, so of course it was your idea. And so we did that first episode. In fact, the first few Duet Reviews were just Aisling and myself, because it was something.
You did Ratatusical.
Yeah, we did Ratatusical. We did the Lorax when the young Vic did it. And or was it the old Vic? It's one of the Vics did the Lorax.
One of the Vics.
But it was always just that, okay, this is something that's existing for a short period of time. It doesn't necessarily have the big prestige or regularity of a schedule like the things that we were covering our main reviews on, or even if by that point we were doing things on the streaming services that we could access more permanently in that way. So the Duet Review really came about as just if something sort of a little more haphazard is presented that we want to cover, it was an easy way of responding to that. But then something interesting happened after that, and that's the fact that live theater came back.
It did.
And we decided that if we are going to review live shows that were starting to appear in the city, the Duet Review format was a little better suited to it than our main 4-person panel review format, by virtue of the fact that, you need to get all of the panelists to see the same show. If we are responding to something that's only happening for a limited amount of time in the run that it's having in the city, we want to get these episodes out fairly quickly. So the very first duet review we did of a live show happening in the city was the production of Gloria by Brandon Jacobs Jenkins, which was done at Crow's Theatre in association with ARC. And so Jill and I saw that show and just came home that evening, sat down. We lived together, but we sat down in separate rooms, as we do with all of these duet reviews, got on Zoom and recorded ourselves talking about it. And we just put out that episode. It was the first episode of any kind that we did reviewing a live show. And very shortly after we did that, we started getting emails from theater companies.
That's right.
Inviting us to review their shows. And just like that, we went from being, oh yeah, this podcast thing that, covers pro shots is something we're all doing during the pandemic, to, are we theater critics? I think we might be theater critics. We're getting invited to shows as press.
How did we fallen into this mess?
Yeah, we sort of became theater critics by accident.
Yes.
And I use the term theater critics lightly here. We are reviewers, because we
are theater enthusiasts, Ryan.
Yes. That's exactly where I'm going with it. As we specify in our mandate that this is a platform first and foremost for theater artists, scholars, and enthusiasts. And enthusiasts is the blanket term that we put forward as identifying ourselves. We don't do theater criticism, we do theater enthusiasm, which is still a kind of reviewing, and we're just responding to the shows we see, but we're always looking for the positive. We like to just generate excitement, and we use this long form format that we've put forward already in the longer reviews, or the 4-person panel reviews that we've pared down into the duet reviews, to really just dive deep into what is this piece doing? What is the thing that we can kind of cut to the core of and talk about? How can we use a format like podcasting or YouTube series that isn't confined to something like column inches or word counts, and just have a free-form conversation about this piece, kind of putting back into the world a more nuanced discourse that isn't just contingent on, oh yeah, this is something, the actors were good, you should or should not go see it, as unfortunately a lot of mainstream theater criticism is, because it's consumer criticism. It is being invited to, in a very short period of time, or in a very short word count, to just relay whether or not you should spend your money on this thing. But we have this platform, this format that really allows us to get into it in more detail. We do this kind of long form, heavily dramaturgical criticism that's dialogue based, and really does allow us to have conversations and maybe disagree and change each other's minds, and that's perfectly okay. So that's really how, not just that the duet review format came about, but how the duet review turned into almost the main thing we do. How, for people who have been confused by the differences between these two terms, part of me has kind of been wondering, is this a helpful distinction of I know it came about by virtue of the fact that duet reviews were second, but now that every time we review something in the city, it's always a duet review, and people are probably looking at those as the main reviews, and it's kind of rare when we go back to a streaming service vault for a 4-person panel, and why is that the review, but this is something else. And
I think it all says it in the title. It's two people. It's a duet. Exactly. So it's a duet review.
I'm happy to keep it, but as we've been going through this, I've been wondering what the utility of this distinction is. Could they just all be reviews? I don't know if we're alienating or confusing people by having this distinction.
I like the distinction.
I like it too, and I'm not against it. And I'm not
My organization brain appreciates it.
Okay, I'm not suggesting we neutralize the distinction. I feel like when you actually put it into words that, our main reviews are duet reviews, and then we have these other things that are called just reviews that are more people and not responding to current plays that are happening in the city. I can understand why people might be confused by it, but if you're happy with this distinction, so am I.
I think so. I don't think foursome reviews flows as nicely off the tongue if we were to swap things around.
In a way, they could just be all reviews if we neutralize the distinction and lump the two together, but it is helpful. The problem is that it's not just that duet reviews are always new plays. Every so often we will just do a duet review of something streaming. Something like the Ian McKellen's one-man show, which was available on National Theatre. That's a good example of something that didn't really justify getting 4 people together to talk about. So you and I just did it as a duet review. But at the end of the day, I'm fine with this distinction, but I do recognize the peculiarness of how set up the infrastructure of what counts as one or the other.
It does get a little muddy, because, I mean, we have a big project that technically could fall under the duet review category, but it's not, and that's our Nicholas Nickleby mini-series, which is kind of its own island all unto itself, because it didn't quite fall into a duet review, because I don't know why we never called it a duet review. I think it's because duet reviews weren't around yet.
No, they were around. I think we did use the language of duet review in those first couple episodes. But we sort of just realized that this is going to be its own thing, that it was 9 consecutive weeks of we're just talking about this one very long show, that we eventually phased out calling it a duet review, even though structurally that's exactly what it was. But it felt special enough in its own right that we gave it its own little oasis. But sorry, continue.
Exactly. No, that's exactly what I was going to say. It's just its own thing, because I mean, we couldn't ask 4 people to be available for 9 weeks as we recorded all these, unless we did recorded them back to back to back. But then I think our stamina would be quite drained. So us doing them on a weekly basis, recording wise, was much handier. So so basically it was one of those weird things where Ryan and I both had seen this on Broadway HD and went, Nicholas Nickleby. It was something I heard Autumn talk about for a long time. My podcast partner Autumn is one of her favorite plays. And then I think you knew about it because it was going to become part of your study material.
Yeah, it was something,
adaptation.
Yeah, as somebody who studies theatrical adaptation as one of my research core interests, it's something that comes up a lot in the scholarly literature on the subject, that this was this massive juggernaut of a production where the Royal Shakespeare Company gave this huge canvas to adapt, letting David Edgar adapt the novel Nicholas Nickleby that is far too long for a conventional stage adaptation, and turning it and just having this massive piece that's cut up in 2 parts, the original staging cut up into 9 parts for when it was later released for TV. And it had intrigued me, everything I'd read about it. And when I saw that it was on Broadway HD, I knew I was going to watch it regardless of whether or not we did content on it. But we had a conversation about what if we did want to do an episode, at the time maybe 1 episode on it, how would that work? It would just be the 2 of us, or could we ask everybody to just watch the whole thing and then get in a panel together? But that's still a lot to ask people who may or may not be as excited about it as we were. The weekly format definitely wouldn't have worked with anyone other than us. And that's what we ultimately decided on. But it was an interesting way. We did a short video as a trailer for the Nicholas Nickleby series. So if people want to know more about, what is this thing exactly? You can watch that. Maybe if you're watching this on YouTube, that's in the top corner right now, showing up. I don't know. But it was a special kind of duet review that justified being 9 continuous episodes, that it deserved to be its own series or sub-series. And something else that I'll say this is something that we may or may not do more of. I know we've always talked about maybe we'd do another mini series of something like The Play Goes Wrong, which has a lot of installments, or maybe Lear Estates, the mini series that they have on Stratfest. Right now, if anyone's a fan of Before the Downbeat, Mac's other podcast, it's not being released yet, but coming up pretty soon, you can hear Mac and I do something similar to this premise that we've done with Nicholas Nickleby. Do you want to tell people what it is?
It is a mini review series of the TV musical show Gallivant. Yes, a show that you and I both adored. So we're diving back into that one.
Yeah, so we're very much borrowing the Nicholas Nickleby format of episodic, 1 episode at a time, synopses, analysis,
check-ins,
key check-ins. But we're letting Before the Downbeat have that one because it is a musical, and
it is a musical.
And so we're happy, but format-wise, if you enjoyed what we did with Nicholas Nickleby, I encourage people
There's another venue for you.
Yes, and maybe we will do more things like that. We just did our episode on Things I Know to Be True, the production at Mervish, in which we talked about how Nicole Kidman is going to be producing a mini-series for probably Australian television based on that play. So when that comes out, maybe we will do another mini-series
I expect nothing less, Ryan.
Yes, so there may be other series like this that will become their own self-contained oasis. of Duet reviews that, just by virtue of being a continuous trajectory, should be combined. But then we capped off Nicholas Nickleby with a special bonus episode a year later, or almost a year and a half later.
We did. It was one of those weird things where we capped it off with a little joke to ourselves of, hey, you know what we could do? We could do a review of that Charlie Hunnam, Jim Broadbent, Christopher Plummer film adaptation of Nicholas Nickleby, because why not? You know?
Yeah, well, you brought it up so many times in our main Nicholas Nickleby episodes as a point of comparison that you were familiar with that I wasn't, that, you know, every time we had our Smike check-in, you had to mention Jamie Bell's more nuanced version of... Yes, so because it had become such a touch point throughout the 9 episodes that we did, we said maybe 1 year later we'll reconvene for a special bonus episode where we would review that movie. And... movies was an interesting new territory for us.
Yes, we hadn't really gone into them.
Yeah, we'd done a few Duet reviews of documentaries, specifically if it was a documentary about a theatrical production. The very first one we did of that was Jill and I reviewed Theatre of War, which was a documentary about a New York production of Brecht's Mother Courage. We thought it's kind of Brechtian that we're reviewing a documentary about a Brecht play. So that was sort of an interesting way that we justified that. It was also part of our Kevin Kline Appreciation Month that we were doing in March of 2021. So we just needed to find theater things with Kevin Kline, and we had almost enough to fill a whole month, but we needed to slot in a documentary just to round it out. So that was unconventional, but then that opened the floodgate for you and I did the various Fiddler on the Roof documentaries, which was exciting. But But documentaries is one thing, narrative feature films is another. And, you know, there's so much film content in the podcast verse on YouTube. We never necessarily thought that films was something we needed to cover. We focused on pro shots of plays and then later live performances of plays. And pro shots and feature film adaptations are very different beasts. One of them is preserving the theatricalness of it and just using film as a medium to engage with that theater if you aren't there in the room. Whereas a film adaptation is treating it as cinema more so than as theater, even if it is based on something that's originally a play. Now, Nicholas Nickleby is not that 2002 film adaptation of Nicholas Nickleby is very much an adaptation of the novel. It's not adapting the Royal Shakespeare Company stage version of it, but it got us thinking about various things we could do with the medium of film, specifically to keep our theater roots of... there's a whole lot of interesting movies that are based on plays or that treat plays as their source material. And as somebody who's very interested in theatrical adaptation, usually more so in the opposite direction of things that start out in one medium and then become theater, you were able to talk me into maybe we could do more programming about things that start off as plays and then get adapted into films. And it was a pretty easy sell. And the funny thing about that, actually, temporally speaking, is that we proposed that idea initially as a stinger at the end of that Nicholas Nickleby bonus episode.
That we did.
Which we filmed in August of this past year. And then because we liked that idea, we got started producing new episodes of the series that went on to be called Screenplays.
That was a name that took some time to figure out.
Yes, it took us a while to think of. I like the
a
name.
Good name for a project.
Yeah, I don't remember what some of the rejected options were. I don't know if you...
I can't really remember.
We have blanked them from our memory. Once we came up with screenplay. I feel like we had some, like, you know, boring ones like play to film or stage to screen, but those... Stage to
screen was one.
Yeah, that was a contender. That would have been very descriptive, but doesn't have a lot of cachet, and there's no lack of things that are called that to describe this very thing. But when we came up with screened plays, which is just very clever, there was no way we weren't going to call it that.
That was your creation.
Oh, was it? I didn't actually even remember. I didn't want to take credit for it.
You came up with it. And then, I mean, once you came up with it, it was like, okay, now we got a name.
Now we got to do it.
Now we got to do it.
Now we're committed because we have a name. But the funny thing was that we started producing episodes of this and releasing those episodes before we'd actually released that bonus Nicholas Nickleby episode.
That's right.
Because a movie from 2002 that nobody but us cares about. It's what people care about. It's actually doing surprisingly well in terms of views. That episode, it has more views than some of the other episodes of the Nicholas Nickleby series, which I get with the Nicholas Nickleby series. You know, it's a big commitment for audiences. I'm honestly surprised that they have as many views as they do. But
people like them.
but each episode, by virtue of the structure of it, does have less views than the one before it, which makes sense because there will always be some people who don't come back for the next one, and that will be the case with each subsequent episode, which is why I was surprised then that the film has since usurped the last couple of them in terms of view count, because I guess more people are willing to sit through something about a movie that they watched in one sitting than to come back week after week after week to hear more about this very long play. But yeah, because we felt that, that movie wasn't very topical, it kind of kept getting pushed on our docket for releasing. But then once we inaugurated screenplays and started bringing on guests, your
Jamie.
friend who you introduced, Jamie Knox, who's now all of our friends, but you knew him first as a very wise voice in terms of filmmaking, who we were so happy to have come onto those first 2 episodes. We felt that we owed it to Jamie to get those episodes out sooner rather than later, so they took a little precedence over this weird Nicholas Nickleby capstone that we didn't necessarily need to release. So it's kind of funny then when we did eventually release Nicholas Nickleby bonus episode that we're hinting about this thing we might do, having already released 2 episodes of it by that point. And what were those 2 episodes? The first 2 screenplays we've done?
We had Denzel's, and then we did, in honor of Angela Lansbury, Gaslight.
Yes,
that was
R.I.P.
a Jill suggestion. We were trying to find what could we do to pay tribute to a woman of stage, screen, and television. And it was like, do we have a copy of Life Spirit that she did? I was like, there's got to be a pro shot of that. Then turns out there wasn't. Which I'm like, how did we not pro shot that? Or maybe there was, but it has to be re-released.
Well, we weren't able to find it, even if.
Anyway, we weren't able to find that. So then it was, well, what else? So we already had said, okay, well, coming up this year at Halloween,
and
we have Sweeney Todd starring Angela Lansbury, but we're not going to release that sooner.
Well, and it's funny because at the time when she died, it wasn't yet Halloween. We could have done that. The only problem was that we had already recorded our Jekyll and Hyde episode that we were planning on releasing for Halloween that year. So we thought, well, do we slip in a Sweeney Todd Halloween special and then sit on this Jekyll and Hyde recording for a year to release next year? But that didn't seem fair to Andrew and Patrick, who we both brought on as guests for that one. So we're like, okay, Sweeney Todd will be this coming year's Halloween 2023, but we got to do something else.
You heard it first, people.
Yes, but we have to do something special for Angela Lansbury now. So, Jill found, just through some creative Googling, found out that her very first feature film appearance was in a film that was based on a play.
That's right. And she was Oscar nominated for that role, too.
Which is impressive for a first role.
Yes. So
we
do
did
that.
Gaslight.
Exactly. And now we have another one in the chamber, as well as some other ones lined up.
I feel like we can announce the one that's in the chamber. We don't need to be cloaked and daggered. We're doing Amadeus, which is a very... After
running us fisticuffs the first time around, Ryan and I thought it was time to go back into the operatic ring to go fight another round of Salieri versus Mozart.
Yeah, so we had... Yes, it was a very intense original review we had of the National Theatre production, which actually, because I re-listened to that episode in the lead up to us recording this screenplay, and that was actually the very first National Theatre episode we did.
Makes sense.
As we say at the beginning of that episode, but I had forgotten that was the first one. I knew it was kind of early in that, but we had just gotten access to the National Theatre streaming service. They had been releasing productions during the pandemic.
Right, but it was like one of those things where it's like only happens in the week, and we were busy with Stratford.
Yeah,
so it was like
and we were busy with Stratford, and Stratford kept them on for longer, which gave more time to actually produce and respond to them while they were still up. Whereas they came and went too quickly. Yeah, but we had both watched that production of Amadeus when it was on YouTube, and knew that once it became available through NT at home, that
worth
was
going
the
back to.
First one we wanted to get back into. Yeah, so we have a screenplay on the much more famous version of this play, which is the film. Indeed. And so that'll be coming out fairly soon. No promises about the date, depending on if more topical things keep pushing it down the docket, but we've already recorded it, so you can be sure that's coming up.
Yeah, and as we plan ahead for future programming, we do have a couple in the chamber as well that we're going to start working on getting into production in the near future, so we can kind of get that ball rolling.
Yeah, it's... The kind of interesting thing about screenplays and also the regular reviews, not the Duet reviews or the Nicholas Nickleby reviews, but the Cup reviews and the screenplays, those tend to be not things that need to be released so fast. When we do a duet review of a show that's happening in the city, we want to get it out quickly because we want it to be helpful as a review that's talking about a show that's happening now, to help do a marketing boost for the production.
Yeah.
And so we tend to bank a lot of the episodes of the reviews and the screenplays, which means that it's funny, we just released our episode on National Theatre's 12th Night, the review we did with our good friend Dewey. And we're all talking about how it's New Year's and January and all the things that just happened during New Year's and the holidays. And we didn't release that episode now until March because more topical things took precedence, as they would. But it's funny how there's always a little time capsule element of the things that get pushed down the docket, which is fun.
Exactly. But Ryan, let's talk about something that you were really big in spearheading, which is the Cup interviews.
Yeah.
Which are kind of their own thing as well. It's another venture all on its own that you were the one that kind of came up with it after we had done a few Stratford episodes. You kind of came to the table going, I have an idea for a show. So then it was the question of, do we still call it the Cup? Do we call it something else entirely? And you were really kind of the spearheader of it. And your first episode is still our most watched episode.
Oh, not the first one. It was one that I proposed early on, which is interesting.
True.
So, let's stop burying the lead on this. We do interviews. Maybe you noticed. Maybe that was your introduction to us, is seeing us interview some artist who you particularly liked, and that's what drew your attention to us, and you stuck around for others. But it was an idea that kind of early on. It's funny, as I'm kind of reflecting on the infancy of this branch of the Cup, is because so much of the theater podcast content that exists, especially here in Canada, is just interview based. And I think that's very valuable. And there's a very good place for that. But it kind of, by doing the Stratford reviews at that early juncture, we were creating an interesting niche for ourselves that wasn't being covered by other ones. But if you look at the biggest theater podcasts certainly in Canada, but also just like other ones, like Stageworthy is the big one, Tits and Teeth, the musical one. Our friend Brie Clark, who does Artversations, which featured Jill on an episode of that, and then Jill interviewed her on ours. There's also our friend Anthony Piccioni, who interviewed me on his podcast, which, Indie Arts Today. It's very common that if you're going to cover theater on a podcast, that it's just, let's interview theater artists. That seems to be the standard mold. And it makes sense because the podcast format is so perfect for just interviewing people and having a one-on-one conversation like that. So I bring this up to say that we kind of came, by introducing interviews into what we did, we sort of got ourselves more on this standard podcasty mainstream track of how theater is covered in this medium. But that wasn't a reason not to do it, because something that I thought of very early on, it was like we were 5 Stratford reviews in at this point, when I realized we're kind of asking a lot of people to have presumably watched this whole Stratford production and then be willing to stick around to hear 4 people they may or may not know talk about it for another 2 hours. People who, in most cases, were not involved in the productions. I know we had a few episodes like the ones with Bridget and David, where we had the actors on. But for the most part, it's just, these are 4 people who you, dear viewer, probably don't know personally. Do you find them interesting enough to hear them talk about this for 2 hours, based on the assumption that you've already watched the play? So there's a very limited appeal for that kind of thing. I love that we did it, and I think it's great that we've kept doing it even after this is no longer a theater company. But I recognized early on that, we're asking a lot of the audience for this. Maybe there's other programming we could come up with that will just be more accessible to anyone coming in who hasn't already seen this production or might be interested for other reasons. And the obvious way of going about that was, well, let's interview artists, local artists, people in our community, people we know. And the very first one we did, I know which one you were thinking of, and we'll get to that in a second, but the very first one we did was with our friends, Max Ackerman and Josh Sidlowski, who had just started their new company called Dandelion Theatre. And they were kind of in a very similar boat to Cup of Hemlock insofar as they started this company right before the pandemic, and they were experimenting with online productions similar to what we were doing at the time when we were still that kind of theater company. So it was very much an idea of, let's talk to them about our shared experience. It came from a place that, I talked about this on our 100th episode, but came from a place of, oh no, they're doing the same thing as us. Competition. And no, wait, sober mind. These are
Yes.
colleagues. These are friends. These could be collaborators. Let's help each other. Let's not compete. That there's no room for that in this type of small indie theater atmosphere. So yeah, we brought them on. I hosted the first few interviews at this stage. Since then, Jill has become a lot more invested in the interviews.
Yes.
It's kind of a lot of that has become her baby. You've hosted a few of them here and there, mostly when it's just people you've already known. You interviewed Autumn Smith, your good friend and colleague. You interviewed Michael Roth. You interviewed Arcady and Michael from Talk is Free Theater. Yeah. Am I forgetting one? I feel like you've done a lot less of them.
You did Bridget. You've
taken on? I did Bridget, which was because at the time
I
was exclusively doing
interviews. I don't do as much for one reason or another. I don't really know why. It's just one of those one of those series where Jill's got more connections that and people that she wants to bring forward, and I'm much more happier in my other areas that I go. You don't need to see my face more than you already do. So
and you were already
share the love.
At the time, you were hosting pretty much every episode that wasn't an interview.
That's right.
Because you hosted almost every single one of the 4 people panels until very recently. And it was only when we also had interviews and duet reviews that we had episodes that you weren't on and thus weren't hosting. But whenever you were on, you were hosting. So maybe part of that was just to give you a bit of a break that you don't have to be on all the time. I don't remember if that was part of the rationale at the time, but yeah. And so, but it's funny, when we started doing those interviews, or when I proposed that as something we could do, I had, the Max and Josh in mind as these are people we should be interviewing or talk to and get them on our platform. But the other one that I really had in mind is I had recently read this book called If We Were Villains, which is a very fun novel set in classical Shakespeare conservatory. Maybe some of you have read it. I imagine a lot of you have read it based on the view count. Maybe that's what brought a lot of you to Cup of Hemlock in the first place. But I had just read this novel. We were very immersed in Shakespeare at the time by doing all these Stratford productions. And I thought this would be an interesting person to interview, ML Rio, the novelist of this book that seems topical among all of the Shakespeare that we had spent the pandemic talking about. So I kind of, because she felt like a big star to me at the time, I worked my courage up to writing her an email to invite her onto this by interviewing more local people in the community. We focused on a lot of people we already knew, people who we'd seen doing Zoom productions, because that's all there was at the time. And a lot of those early interviews were about setting up, we're kind of creating a discourse about trying to keep that candle burning of making some kind of theater during the pandemic. But in the back of my mind, I knew that I had to build up confidence in myself as an interviewer, because eventually I would like to reach out to ML Rio and ask her on to be an interview. And it's so funny that, like, you can, prior to having this platform, it would have never occurred to me that you could just reach out to a novelist you liked and invite them onto Zoom. And so long as you call it a podcast, you can have a detailed conversation about their book. Whereas, I would have never thought to do that prior to this. It takes having a platform already to open up possibilities for these kinds of things. I know people write fan mail to authors they like, but that never my style to just write to someone and be like, I like the thing you made.
Yeah.
But having a podcast opened up new possibilities for interviews like that. But then around the time that I did interview ML Rio about her book, which has, skyrocketed, there was a long time there where that was getting new views every single day. Over like 4,000 people have watched it. I accredit all of that to people's love for her and her book, more so than any love they have for Cup of Hemlock Theatre and us, because our subscriber count does not reflect the view count that episode has, which is fine.
We wish it did.
We wish it did, but I recognize that it's probably a lot more book novel people read the book, look her up and find our interview with her, as opposed to people who are interested in theater who are like, ooh, what's this episode? So that's fine. That makes sense. She wrote a very good book. I'm glad so many people have read it and are interested in seeing what she has to say about it beyond the pages of the book itself.
Yeah.
But after that whole summer of interviewing a lot of people, in the lead up to that, it was at the tail end of the summer that I interviewed her. That episode came out in September, and by that point I had gone back to my heavy PhD course load at the time.
Right.
And I was kind of getting burnt out on doing interviews, so I took a chill on it for a while. And that was around the time that Jill got very invested in, she has this big network of artists she's worked with, people she's done plays with. She's an actor, as many of you know, and the interview space at that point became a lot more of just an opportunity for her to talk to people she already knows, or people whose work she admires, about just, it didn't have to always be, oh, you're doing a Zoom show right now, let's talk to you about that, as I had originally conceived most of the interviews to be. It was just, you are an artist, tell me about yourself. And I think that's the best use of the interview format. And that's something that Jill really initiated and really came up with that as a good template that she has hosted now, probably more than either of us.
Yeah, she's done way more interviews than we have.
Yeah, I still interview people from time to time. I needed a big break after that whole summer of interviewing people, especially getting back into the course load grind at the time. And now I interview a lot more people, usually when it's people who've expressed some kind of show for us that, we're not able to review this because of the timing, but maybe we could interview you, the artist, so we can still give you a platform for your work, even if it's work that we're not able to review. Like that, a lot of the interviews that I've done lately have fallen into that category, and I'm happy to do those because I think there's a worthwhile need for doing that. Whereas a lot of Jill's and your interviews have focused on people you either already know or had a specific interest in approaching to interview, which is nice that we kind of cover all of these different perspectives. But there's a lot of interview content, but every interview that exists like in the podcast world and YouTube, but every interview will be different by virtue of the interviewee and the things that are going on in their brain and their work at the time that's worth talking about. So I love that we do the interviews. I wasn't being dismissive of it in the way I described the fact there's so many interviews and the theater content in this internet, but I do think that, it is an interesting addition to the Cup, separate from all those different strains of reviews that we've just talked about.
Exactly. And let's now pivot again to something entirely different, in the words of Monty Python. And now for something completely different. And that is, of course, the Cup Roundtables, kind of the elusive one that doesn't get a ton of episodes on in this area.
The kind of orphaned subseries of the Cup that we...
Orphaned for now, but, we keep having talks about doing more. It's just one of those difficult things where I'm not sure who came up with it. I think it was
you, actually.
I think it was me as well, because it was Shakespeare and gender.
Yeah, and that was something that had come up a lot in the various reviews we had done, and you sort of isolated this as this is a theme that could be interrogated outside of the context of an individual production that does it, and maybe needs a little more breathing room in its own right.
Exactly. So, it was one of those things where we were like, okay, let's do it on its own, but then it was one of those things of, once we did a few, we went, oh my goodness, these are very tricky to organize. Yeah. Because when you think organizing 4 people is tricky, try doing 6.
Well, and that's the funny thing. There doesn't have to be 6 people on a roundtable. Like I guess the way that I've always conceived the roundtables in my head is if a review or one of our different types of reviews is about responding to a specific work that we watched, and an interview is responding to a specific artist, let's talk about you. The roundtable was just what made it a roundtable was we were talking about an abstract concept or something that isn't based in a specific play we saw or a specific person we want to talk to. And that could theoretically be anything. But once we opened it up to that, getting panelists was difficult. Not because people didn't want to be panelists on, we had a lot of interest from people, but if we're going to frame it around a key topic, we want to get the people who have some kind of expertise in it or some at least unique perspective or something that, why are you talking about this? We never really had that problem with the reviews because it was just, you're a theater person, you like seeing shows. What do you think about this show? But if we're going to unpack a topic like Shakespeare and gender, we want people who are very familiar with Shakespeare, whereas you don't have to be familiar with Shakespeare to review a single Shakespeare show, but to unpack. And we want people who have interesting thoughts, if not necessarily expertise, but interesting thoughts about gender bending and casting and the complex nature of something like an antiquated gender binary. So it became cumbersome to always get the panelists we want, to find times that worked for all of the people we wanted to get on. And with our reviews, we always had somebody from the team on standby to join the review in case somebody had to drop out near the last minute. The show must go on kind of mentality. Whereas when we have cultivated specific experts or unique perspectives that we want to have on talk about this, it was harder to just be, okay, sorry, you can't make it anymore. Stand by, you're in. It didn't quite have the same, significance of, well, why am I on this episode now? I'm just here because somebody dropped out. So yeah, the roundtables, we did a few of them, but we had a very long list of topics that we wanted to cover as roundtables, but that most of them have yet to happen and maybe never will. What are the roundtables we have done so far? Because there's not a lot of them.
We've done Shakespeare and Gender.
Yeah.
We did one all about musicals.
Yeah, and are musicals low art? Yeah.
Yeah, low art. Yes, that was a good one.
Do You Hear the People Sing? We gave it a funny musical title.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's still a very quippy title.
Yeah.
And then have we did a third?
Sondheim was the third, which...
That's right. Yes, we did the Sondheim Roundtable in honor of the passing of the great Stephen Sondheim.
Yeah, we did the 1 year anniversary of his passing.
Yes, we did.
We did a special roundtable all about just his work and kind of a tribute in that. And then, well, I guess we could technically say we did a fourth because our 100th episode we called a roundtable.
Right.
By you, me, and Jill just getting in a Zoom room and talking, which, hey, that kind of sounds a lot like this new...
Exactly.
What we're doing now, that basically, in essence, was the first Cup editorial, but we didn't know to call it that at the time. So this brings us to what we're doing right now, full circle.
Yeah, full circle.
That the Cup editorial basically are things that could have been roundtables, but we're making it easier for ourselves by having either just one expert guest who we could easily converse with, or just keeping it within the team. And we can talk about this topic just based on our own opinions, which maybe aren't expertise, but we have developed our own thoughts and apparently very bold opinions about theater, as the etiquette editorial will reveal that, we are people who are able to just talk amongst ourselves about these. It doesn't always need to be, if we want to have a conversation about an abstract topic, it doesn't need to be, okay, find 6 people who have a lot of, who've published on this topic, for example. Maybe one person who's published on this topic would be a nice way. I say this to say that we're not necessarily doing away with the roundtables, but I think we will find that a lot of the ideas for roundtables that we've had but weren't able to get off the ground, you might see them coming up a little more frequently as editorials in this way. And it's a much more simplified solution for us to get these topics into our platform and into the discourse as we would like to see them presented, without coordination nightmare that unfortunately our attempts at roundtables have been. But when we do have an idea that we think really does benefit from specific individuals who we'd like to hear from, more of them, we will still try to get a roundtable into the bloodstream when we see
We
fit.
do have plans for more. We do have a list of topics that may ultimately end up being an editorial, but they may still end up being a roundtable, depending on if we find there's enough people. Because that's the thing. Like with Sondheim, it was one of those lucky topics where there's enough people in the theater community who know and revere Sondheim that it's easy to find, the right kind of task. The etiquette one was originally pitched as a roundtable, but then it kind of became, let's simplify that one.
Yeah, the question became, who are the experts in theater etiquette? And it was hard to think of, we could think of, I know this person who's an usher, and they might have a specific usher opinion, but their opinion would be colored entirely by the fact that they are an usher, and they maybe wouldn't be able to think about the concept more holistically. So that was a good example of a topic that was proposed as a roundtable, but seemed better suited to let's just us 3 friends get in a Zoom room and talk about our differing opinions about this thing. And we will, as I mentioned, we'll have editorials where we do bring on one guest who has expertise. I think that there's a lot of room for that, and we'll only default to roundtables when we really think the multiplicity of expert voices is necessary.
Exactly.
It's funny, I remember a long time ago, you proposed an idea for something that I guess was a spiritual successor to editorials, but never really got off the ground, or we never wound up producing any of them, where you would propose something like Cup debates, where it would be specifically...
Who knows, Ryan? That show could still exist.
Well, now I think anything we would have proposed as a debate could just be an editorial, just as our etiquette editorial very quickly turned into a debate.
Yes.
But yeah, you had proposed the idea of where we specifically get 2 people, kind of classic debate format, representing alternative opinions, and maybe a moderator to have it as a debate. I think at the time, this was when the Tonys were debating whether or not to happen in that first year after the pandemic, when there was very little live theater.
And then also it was the idea of one of our co-founders, Will Bartley, has vocally said that he's not the biggest fan of musicals in the world.
Right.
And so the whole concept of musicals being low art, and then that being a debate between myself as a big musical fan and Will being on the opposite, not so much on the opposite, but just on a differing perspective, the value they bring, it's one of those things where it's like, I think he and I could have a very good debate with like Ryan acting as like moderator.
Yeah,
and it's one of those things where we spun it into, well, let's get a whole bunch of musical theater people together. So making it a debate, let's make it into a active conversation between all these people in musical theater world.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up because I'd forgotten that was the case. And I guess if I'm remembering correctly, then was that around the time of Will and Ed gracefully stepping down from the company? Was that why we turned that, what could have just been the conversation between you and Will, into a roundtable? Or was that just deciding that it would benefit more from whole perspectives?
It was just us deciding that there was more people who were interested because Jill had thoughts on musicals, and we had a number of panelists who had all reached out who we knew were big musical people. Right. So it was one of those things of, why limit it to 2 when we can easily get more people? And at the time it was, this can't be that hard to organize.
Well, yeah, it's after we just struggled to organize one. And at the time we had such lofty ambitions. We were thinking we'd do a roundtable once a month.
Exactly.
To slot that between the reviews and the interviews, because at the time it was just those 3. And yeah, we very quickly realized that it was quite ambitious to plan that many roundtables. And yeah, like, I think editorial format makes debates redundant because we can have debates as editorials, and it much more elegantly fits into the format that we've already now established for editorials, that you can have a debate, but they don't all have to be debates. It's just a space where we can talk about something that's on our mind. And as a result, I said this at the beginning, I can't imagine what we would now have to come up with as a brand new series, unless it's something like another Nicholas Nickleby-esque mini series, which is basically just glorified duet reviews. But I feel like we'd be very hard pressed to come up with a new format for the Cup that can't fit into one of the series that we've come up with already. So I am comfortable saying that this is the slate of programming we have on the Cup. We have our reviews, which also contains duet reviews. We have our Nicholas Nickleby series. We have screenplays. Those are the reviews. And then we also have interviews. We sometimes have roundtables. And now we have Cup editorials. And if you scroll back far enough, you'll find things like a full stage reading of Ibsen's Ghosts, or you'll find COH shorts, and maybe we might still do shorts every so often.
We do have ideas for more shorts. It's just one of those things where you need time to rehearse them and get them organized. And once again, now that everybody's back to the living, like outside the
it's
condos,
hard to get people on Zoom to want to do Zoom plays anymore at this point. And it's funny, I made a bald-faced lie of a promise when we did our 100th episode, when I said there will be a Christmas COH short, because that had been my undertaking. The Jew of the team loves doing the Christmas shorts, but I did not manage to have the time to slap together a short for Christmas, so we just didn't do that. We did our duet review. Year? Yeah, maybe. No promises. I've learned not to promise now. But you and I did our duet review of Ronnie Burkett's Little Dickens, and that was our Christmas programming. But I could not make good on my promise to do a little short stage reading of a Christmas-themed play, despite my best intentions. So maybe we'll do more shorts. But at the end of the day, we have made peace with the fact that we are a talk show first, and a theater company not even second, maybe like 10th, if we do that at all. We have enough tendrils of the Cup as a program for discourse on theater.
We have diversified enough.
Yes, and that's if there's some kind of thesis statement you could say about all this, is that as terrible as the pandemic was for so many reasons, obviously, the fact that this show that probably would not have existed without it came out of it, and that we are keeping it up, and it has developed a little community of people who are interested in it, that we get invited to shows, that people do want to hear what we have to say about their work. I think the world doesn't necessarily need more indie companies. That's not to discourage anyone from starting their own. By all means, please do, but there's nothing wrong with realizing that there's different niches you could fill, or that there's different fruitful developments that are still equally valuable to the world of theater. That doesn't necessarily mean producing theater itself.
Yes, that's exactly well put, Ryan.
Yeah, and that's what we do here at the Cup.
Yeah, and there we go. And that's where we'll leave you for this first episode. Stay tuned. We got some more editorials coming your way, and a bunch of other content too. As you can see, we have a plethora of streams we can go down at any given week. So,
and you never know which one it's going to be, and that's exciting too. It might be actually a little while before you get our next editorial, even though we have filmed the etiquette one, which might not even be the next one we do. We have so much other content coming up, some things more time specific than others, that it could be a couple months from now before you get another editorial. But now we've opened up the floodgates of this is a possible episode you might be able to expect sometime.
Exactly. And Ryan, I think before we sign off, we got to get that classic Ryan Borochovitz send-off.
Okay, yeah. So, hey, can you find Ryan on social media? No, you shouldn't bother. But if you like me, just follow Cup of Hemlock. This is where all of my opinions about theater live. We are at COH Theater on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, if anybody's still on Twitter. And if you're watching this on YouTube, like, share, subscribe. If you're listening to this as a podcast, do the podcast things. How about you? Where can people find and follow you?
Follow me at Mackenzie Horner, all social media platforms. You can also follow all my musical antics over at Before the Downbeat, a musical podcast, where, as Ryan mentioned, we are doing a mini-series on Gallivant. When this comes out, well, I'm not sure.
This is coming out pretty soon from when we're recording, so I don't believe any of that will have been released yet.
So then it will be. So then Ryan and I are still in the middle of getting the mini-series ready. So you'll have to get caught up on all the other stuff Ryan and I have done together over there, like our Fiddler live commentary,
and use this time to watch Gallivant, because it's a great show, and then you'll be all caught up for when we talk about it.
There you go. That too. I love it. All right. More than that, everybody, stay healthy, stay safe, and we will see you all in the very next episode. Have a great rest of your day.